Hi, and welcome to another episode of About the Authors TV. I'm your host, Jake Brown. Whether you're a fan of books like The Red Lotus, Flight Attendant, The Sandcastle Girl, Midwives, or Skeletons at the Feast, among 30 in total in print in 20 countries around the world, whether it's an Oprah Book Pick of the Week, or a New York Times bestseller, or even an HBO adaptation like The Flight Attendant recently was, Chris Bohjalian is the creator of it all, and he joins us today on the show. Chris, we're so excited to have you with us. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me on.
First of all, congratulations on the massive success of the HBO adaptation of The Flight Attendant. Kaylee Cuoco did such an amazing job with Cassandra Bowden. You must have really felt like she was exactly who you had in your head when she first popped in it, before anyone else had met her. Take us back to that moment, if you would.
It's not so much that the characters pop into my head, it's the premise. So The Flight Attendant began this way. I had just flown from Yerevan, Armenia to JFK.
Wow.
Landed about 5:30. I was meeting a friend in New York City for dinner at 6:30. So I go right to the restaurant, drop off my bags in the coat room, and I'm an hour early. So I do the only common sense thing. I go to the bar and I order in Arak, ARAK. It's an anise flavored Middle Eastern alcohol. Imagine weaponized ouzo. And as I'm drinking it, three threads came together alchemically to create Cassandra Bowden. The first thread was that bar. We've all been in a gorgeous bar. The bottles of booze with their immaculate labels, the martini glasses, highball glasses, the wine glasses. So that was the first thread, alcohol. And I come from a family of alcoholics, so I will never glamorize alcoholism, but that was the first thread.
Okay.
The second thread, the miracle of aviation. I had had breakfast in Armenia. I'm having dinner in New York City. You can only do that because of airplanes. So the second thread. And the third thread, Russia. I've always been fascinated by Russia. I mean, this is the country that gave us Dostoevsky, Tchaikovsky, the Bolshoi Ballet, and without fail, whoever's in the Kremlin is an actual James Bond villain. Now, in the Mesozoic era of my childhood, I had an aunt who was a stewardess. That's what we called them in the 1960s. And she flew internationally. And we always used to laugh that she was a spy because she'd disappear for days at a time, off radar. And so I asked the bartender for a bunch of paper napkins. And I wrote the first 3 pages of The Flight Attendant at that bar, waiting for my dinner companion. And I knew who that flight attendant was. An alcoholic hot mess with real demons. There's a reason she makes the mistakes she makes. And I was off and running.
A bar napkin of all places. That's fantastic. As you got to know Cassandra more personally on paper and more intimately and vividly as she came to life for you, take us inside that process as it was happening.
I knew Cassie right away. I knew her as well as I knew my family. And here's the thing that's so ironic. In the very first draft of The Flight Attendant, there's a scene where Cassie Bowden is watching an episode of The Big Bang Theory in her hotel room in Italy. Because I love The Big Bang Theory. And when I watch Kaylee Cuoco bring Cassie Bowden to life, I realize this was Cassie all along. Cassie Bowden in the novel is that wounded bird who flies into your living room window, dusts off her wings, and flies into the same window the next day. She's heartbreaking, but she's smarter than hell. She has more childhood demons than most of us. And that's why she drinks. That's why she is who she is. And Kaylee Cuoco was the perfect human being to bring her to life because she so magnificently channels Cassie Bowden's heartbreak and hilarity. She just nails it. So yeah, I always sort of heard that voice in my head. I never, in my wildest dreams, it never crossed my mind that Kaylee would read the novel and say, holy cow, this is what I want to do next. But it was a monumental gift, and it really was perfect karma.
Waking up in the AM next to a dead body would be a nightmare for anybody in any scenario, I imagine. How early in the story did that particular opening scene come to you?
All the premise I had was this. This is the entire premise. Alcoholic, hot mess of a flight attendant picks up a passenger in 3C, wakes up the next morning in his bed, rolls over with the mother of all hangovers, and she's a blackout drunk, and sees he's dead. So she does what seems to her to be the only sensible thing. Get the hell out of Dodge. Lie to her flight crew, lie to the FBI when she gets back to America, only to discover you cannot run from a body you leave behind in a bed. Now, if I had a template for the book, it was that great Alfred Hitchcock movie, North by Northwest. Cary Grant plays Roger Thornhill, an alcoholic who is spending the first hour of the movie wondering who is trying to kill him. And the second hour of the movie, once he knows it's the Russians, trying to clear his name. So when I was envisioning this book originally, I thought the 1960s. That's when it would be set. But later in 2016, I was back in Armenia and I was standing at the line of contact with Azerbaijan. It's a no man's land of trenches. I was there for the New York Times as a correspondent. You know, I got my flak jacket on, I got my helmet on, and I'm chatting with a philanthropist who works with Russian oligarchs. And all of a sudden, he's telling me without irony the difference in cost in an execution in Dubai versus Donetsk. How it costs 15 grand to off someone in Dubai, but only 5 grand to do it in Donetsk. And I'm thinking to myself, oh, this is just gold. And so instead of setting the book in the Cold War 1960s, I present, which certainly has its share of villains.
How early in life did you first discover your extraordinary gift with words? We've talked to so many authors for the show who really feel like they were born writing. Was that the case for you?
I've been writing virtually my entire life. When I was in the 2nd and 3rd grade, I was writing these hideous 2- and 3-page short stories about sibling rivalry on the school safety patrol and disembodied hands that emerged from wishing wells. When my father died, I discovered that my mother, who died years and years ago, had saved a lot of these stories. And then my father had. And in a sweater box under his bed was the oldest short story in existence that I ever wrote. It's hideous. It's truly horrible, but my penmanship, I crushed it. My cursive was to die for. And I share this with you because even at 9 years old, even at 8 years old, you could see the way that dread was always going to be important to my work. This is the last sentence of the earliest short story still in existence I ever wrote. The dripping stopped and the vultures had their meal.
That's so cool. Thank you for sharing that with us. I see on the bookcase behind you, there's loads and loads of books. Who were a few that you first pulled off your parents' shelf as a kid that really intrigued you?
My mom was a voracious reader, and she was a bit of a book collector, and she was really patient with me. Here is how much my mother loved me. I took the dust jacket as a little boy of her first edition of The Old Man and the Sea, and in the sky above the Caribbean, I drew in the Starship Enterprise, NCC 1701, and in the sea itself, the submarine from Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea. I took her first edition of To Kill a Mockingbird with all of those leaves on the tree and turned it into a Peter Max poster. I still have those two books, minus the dust jackets, and she loved me still. As for the books that I read as a kid that really influenced me, when I was in 8th grade, my family moved from a suburb of New York City to Miami, Florida, which is then arguably a suburb of New York City. And we moved there the Friday of Labor Day weekend. Tuesday, I started school at Palm Springs Junior High. And then after school, went to see my new orthodontist, the sadist it would turn out if ever there was one. And he gave me some orthodontic headgear that looked like the business end of a backhoe. And I had to wear said device for 4 hours a day. I looked like Bane from Batman. And I couldn't sleep when I was wearing it, and I couldn't speak when I was wearing it. So I'd come home from school, and I would go to the Hialeah Miami Lakes Public Library, put in my headgear, and read. And I read all the books that an 8th grade boy was likely to read in the mid to late 1970s. I read William Peter Blatty's The Exorcist. I read Peter Benchley's Jaws. I read, for the first time, Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird, and Joyce Carol Oates' remarkable book, Expensive People. And I still remember the first sentence. It's 5 words. I was a child murderer. The next 3 pages deconstruct that one short sentence. Is the narrator an adult who on a regular basis murders small children, or an adult who one time, as an accident, murdered a child? I was a child murderer. And as I grew into an adult writer, I think I always like to walk that tightrope between the kind of book that William Peter Blatty or Peter Benchley might write and the kind of book that Joyce Carol Oates and Harper Lee might write.
Great combination. You started very early on when you got to Amherst, also working for the Burlington Free Press. That was a very early track for your career, wasn't it? Kind of got you started ahead of everybody.
Amherst, I'm a writer because of Amherst. I really am. Reading Russian literature with Stanley Rabinowitz, it was a game changer. But my most recent novel, Hour of the Witch, 2 of my Amherst professors are in the acknowledgments, David Wills and Barry O'Connell, because of the nexus of American literature and Puritan theology. I was a terrible test taker. I was just a nightmare. So all my courses were essays. I wrote so much. I was always writing for that, and I was writing for the newspaper, the Amherst Student, all the time. That was influential. And then you mentioned the Burlington Free Press. Yeah, I wrote a column for the Burlington Free Press every Sunday, but 2, for nearly 25 years. And you do that as a labor of love. And it was for me such a labor of love. And it helped as a novelist because, week after week, 19 column inches, 675 words. How do you distill a moment down to its essence? That was invaluable, and I loved it. The only reason I stopped writing that column was because after nearly 25 years, no one wanted to read my 25th Mother's Day column.
Your storied catalog began with A Killing in the Real World, and we've spoken to some authors for the show who absolutely love their first book and others who don't want a thing to do with it. Where do you fall along that spectrum?
Oh my God, those books are so bad. A Killing in the Real World, single worst first novel ever published, bar none. There is no book in any library system in the world worse than A Killing in the Real World. I wrote A Killing in the Real World before I was writing for the newspaper. When I graduated from college, I started work in advertising. And in the mid 1980s, I was at an ad agency in New York City called J. Walter Thompson. And I was writing short stories. And I was sending them to the New Yorker and Harper's and the Sewanee Review and being summarily and consistently rejected. I wrote them between 5 and 7 a.m. in the morning before shaving and taking the subway to work. So I got rejection slip number 250 and thought to myself, plan A, not working. Time to try plan B. And so I rounded up 6 months worth of Cosmopolitan because Cosmo was still publishing a lot of fiction. And then I wrote what I thought was the perfect Cosmopolitan short story. It's about a female supermodel who lives in a huge loft in Lower Manhattan. She's married to a fabulously wealthy arbitrage trader, but their marriage is a little bit dicey. So one weekend, she goes out to their beach house on Fire Island to see if the marriage can be saved, but instead spends most of the time playing scantily clad beach volleyball. Cosmopolitan bought it. First story I ever sold. And when it appeared in print, agents started approaching me and they all wanted to know, did I have a novel? And I didn't. I've been writing short stories. But this was the era of Bright Lights, Big City by Jay McInerney, Tama Janowitz, Bret Easton Ellis. So I tried to write a New York City book about young adults, and it's horrific. Everything about it is just a train wreck. And yet, because it was the late 1980s and it was set in New York, I could have published a grocery list. And so St. Martin's acquired it. And I've been working in New York City. I'm not at Iowa at the Writers' Workshop. I don't know a lot of writers. I need a blurb. At J. Walter Thompson at the time, there's another writer. He's published 4 or 5 books. He is the creative director of the ad agency. His office is the size of a tennis court. I'm in this teeny cubicle. But I go to him and ask him if he'll please blurb the book. And he does. He's really kind. And I'm going to read you the blurb, and then I'm going to tell you who it is because it's the best part of the book. Okay, this is the blurb. Christopher Bohjalian's novel is witty, well-written, and best of all, fresh, blah, blah, blah. Mystery of the captured spirit of the real world, blah, blah, blah. I'm looking forward to Bohjalian's next. Who is the blurb? James Patterson.
Wow. That's heavy.
Yeah. Now, despite James Patterson's blurb, the book still sold about 7 copies, and that's because my father really loved me and bought 6.
Do you have better memories of writing your second novel, Hangman?
No, Hangman's terrible also. But it's marginally less horrible. I still don't allow it back in print. It's a perfectly adequate New England ghost story. I just moved to Vermont and I was in a house that really creeped me out. I'd lived there for 30 years, despite the fact it often really creeped me out. But the world didn't need another very predictable New England ghost story. I
Okay.
was still learning my craft. I really didn't figure it all out until my fifth novel, Midwives. I mean, Malcolm Gladwell talks about that 10,000 hour rule. You need to do something for 10,000 hours. The Beatles need to play in Hamburg for 10,000 hours. My 10,000 hours of fiction was about it, Midwives. There's something to that.
Please introduce viewers, if you would, to Sybil Danforth. She's the star of the celebrated Midwives, who was your first #1 on the New York Times bestseller list, and she really had a lot to do with that. What made that character so special from the beginning?
Writers talk with an agonizing amount of hubris about where we found our voice. But to a certain extent, I found my voice in Sybil Danforth, in Midwives, or to be precise, in Sybil's daughter, Connie, who narrates Midwives. The book had its origins at a dinner party. My wife and I have a 6-month-old baby, and we're in Vermont. And I realized that the woman sitting next to me is this magnificent midwife, this amazing human being named Carol Gibson Warnock. She catches babies at home, and she says to me, if you and Victoria had had your Grace at home, instead of going all the way to the hospital, you could have caught Grace in your bedroom. And I had never heard the verb catch used before in the context of birth. And I got really interested. And the more I chatted with Carol Warnock, the more I realized there was an amazing novel waiting to be told in home birth. I didn't know what it would be, but there was something there. And so the next day, Carol and I had lunch at this diner in central Vermont, long gone, called the Squirrel's Nest. And this was 1993.
Wow.
And so she brought with her all of these books about home birth midwifery. Ina May Gaskin's Spiritual Midwifery, Penny Armstrong, Laurel Thatcher Ulrich's A Midwife's Tale. And I grew hypnotized. Now, when I started this book, I thought Midwives was going to be a gently comic novel about a teenager coming of age in the 1980s with her hippy-dippy midwife. No one was going to die. It wasn't going to be a courtroom drama. I was about 5,000 words into it when my mother was diagnosed with cancer, and it was terminal. And my family does a lot of things well, but death is not among them. This was going to be nasty. It was going to be bad. And the novel I was writing took a left-hand turn I never expected. And I started interviewing midwives and asking them this question. Have you ever had a baby die? And they all had. Babies die if you do it long enough. They're miscarriages, they're stillbirths. It happens. So then I got really dark. And I started asking, have you ever had a mother die in a home birth? And most of them hadn't. It's rare. And I said, well, what would you do if you had a mother die? And a midwife in New Hampshire said, I get the sharpest knife in the house. Because midwives do not carry scalpels. Why would they? They're not surgeons. And I said, tell me more about that. And she said, well, if the mother's dead, I've got a few minutes to maybe save the baby. And the book changed dramatically into the courtroom drama that we all know. I love Sybil Danforth as a character, and I love Connie Danforth as a character. But writing that book for me was life-changing for a couple of reasons. First of all, because it's the first time I wrote a really, really dark book.
Yeah.
But a dark book with characters you care about and deep moral ambiguities. It was a emotional roller coaster for me that I will always cherish.
I bet. But then again, this book resonated roundly with readers, so much so that Sissy Spacek and some other really fine actors brought it to life on the silver screen. How much fun was that for you?
Can I tell you one other great actor in that movie? Sissy Spacek is to die for great as Sybil Danforth, but playing Connie Danforth in her breakout role is a young Allison Pill, who now we see, in Star Trek. We saw her in Newsroom. She's got, Emmy nomination. She's been on Broadway. Allison Pill is just fantastic. You're either 100% in the writer's room or you're not. The decision I've always made is this. Does the person who wants to make the movie or the TV series understand and respect the material? I mean, to go back to the flight attendant, that was what was so key about Kaylee. She so got the book. She so understood who Cassie was. I mean, Kaylee isn't just a great actor. She is so freaking smart. And she just really got it. To go back to Past the Bleachers, that was first optioned by a screenwriter named Don Reimer. And he really, really understood the book, Past the Bleachers. The notion that it's about two things. One, a couple grieving for the loss of their little boy to leukemia, but also the way baseball bonds parents and children. Those were the two things. And as far as I was concerned, he could add an asteroid to the screenplay if you kept those two elements. I mean, he didn't, but that was what was important to me. So my advice to novelists or short story writers who are so blessed as to have someone who wants to make a TV series or film out of the book is this. You either say, this person understands the material and have a ball and just love the experience, or you say, and you write this into the contract, I am involved every step of the way. And you might not get nearly as much as you want, but that's the decision to make. And I mean, I've always been so thrilled with the movies and TV series based on my work, and I've never set foot in the writer's room.
That's great advice. But then again, it must be that much more fantastical when you're watching something that came completely out of your mind come to life on a big screen in a movie theater.
It is surreal. And I'm always doing the Ed Grimley happy dance. I'm doing the Ed Grimley happy dance when I see a moment from the book perfectly rendered on the screen. And I'm doing the happy dance when I see something not from the book, but is inherently logical and magnificent. And I've seen so much of both in, for example, The Flight Attendant, which I just adore. I mean, I love that TV series. But for example, in the TV series, in the very first few minutes, you see Cassie Bowden and Alex Sokolov talking on the plane about Russian literature, exactly as they do in the book. They're talking about Dostoevsky. I was in heaven watching those two characters discuss Dostoevsky. And here's a scene not in the book, but is utterly and completely wonderful. Cassie Bowden has a judgmental sister in the novel. She has a judgmental brother in the TV series played by T.R. Knight. And there's a scene in the TV series, and no spoilers, don't worry, when Cassie and her brother go to the New York City Aquarium, and she's with her two nieces, and it is so beautiful and so heartbreaking and so moving. And that belongs entirely to showrunner Steve Yockey and his writing team. And it's just gold.
So it sounds like you'd really found your true voice as an author by the time you sat down to write The Law of Similars. Is it true that that book was partly inspired by a real visit to a homeopath?
My wife and I had a daughter in preschool. And preschool, as every parent knows, is the Latin term for you're going to get a cold. And I got one, and it just never went away. And finally went to my doctor, and he said, Bohjalian, man up. It's a cold. Almost on a lark, I went to see the local homeopath because their office was above my gym. And when I was talking to her, I fell in love with the language of homeopathy. Like cures like. And the names of the remedies, oh my gosh, as a writer, candy. Imagine arsenicum, syphilinum. Arsenicum is my constitutional remedy. And so I started taking arsenicum, and I was off and running.
With Buffalo Soldier, Transistor Radio, and Before We Know Kindness, you cover a lot of new topical territory with readers. Do you enjoy taking them into new places and think about things they might not have from the same perspective before reading your books?
I write about whatever interests me at that moment. And that's what I care about. Now, 2021 is very different than 2000. In 2021, it would be inappropriate for me to write some of the books I wrote 20 years ago, and I would not write them. I understand that, and I'm fine with that. That point noted, I'm still proud of the fact that I wrote those, even if now I'm not the right person to write them. We've come a long way, thank God. And all of a sudden, we have the voices telling those stories that should be telling those stories, not me. You know, one of those things those four books also have in common is they were in the zeitgeist, but at exactly the wrong time. I mean, writing a transsexual love story in 2000, writing about animal rights and veganism in 2004, writing about white privileges in 2002. My timing is often imperfect.
Idle Banner, Excursions from a Small Town, had a very northern exposure kind of vibe. This was actually a collection of your stories from over the years, correct? From all of your different columns?
The column was called Idle Banter, IDYLL, because it's about an idyllic rural community. So the book was always going to be called Idle Banter because it's about my column. I added weekly excursions to a very small town because I wrote the column every week, and I wanted it to feel like you're visiting Lincoln, Vermont, which is where I used to live. And most of those columns are set in Lincoln, Vermont. And so whether you're reading the book in Wales or San Diego, whether you're in London, England, or Joplin, Missouri, I wanted it to feel like an excursion to this place rather like Brigadoon. The fog rises, and there's Lincoln with all its weirdness.
You leave Vermont and head all the way back to World War II with Skeletons at the Feast. What first inspired you about this wartime diary to make you want to turn it into a full book?
My family have great, very close friends, some of our closest friends in the world, Gerd and Laura Cron. And Gerd and Laura have a daughter, our daughter's age, Greta. And one day, Gerd and I were picking up our daughters at kindergarten in Lincoln. And Gerd said, my mother just finished translating her mother's diary of the years living in Prussia between 1920 and 1945. Would you take a look at it? And normally when someone says to me, would you look at my grandmother's diary? I break out in hives. But Gerd and I are great friends. So I said, of course. And the diary was really remarkable. It chronicles what it was like for this one family to be living in Nazi Germany in this horrific time. They lived on a sugar beet farm. And Laura Cron, often laughs and says, you can't call it a beet farm. You always have to call it a sugar beet farm. And so I didn't write historical fiction then, in my opinion. I'd never succeeded. So I sent the diary to the University Press of New England, which is the editorial publisher at the time for Brandeis, Tufts, Dartmouth, the University of Vermont, and to my editor at Random House. And they both said the same thing. This woman, Eva, really remarkable. And her story is incredible, but kind of heavy on the sugar beets. So no one wanted to publish it, and I thought, fine, and Gerd was fine. Then, however, probably, 6-7 years later, I read Max Hastings' history of the last year of the war in Germany. Armageddon. And I kept seeing all of these scenes that reminded me of the diary, including January 1945, the hundreds of thousands of Prussian refugees on the eastern bank of the Oder River, or the Vistula River, hoping to cross it ahead of the Russians as the Russians are shelling the river. And I remembered that Eva and her family, including Gerd's mother, were among those refugees. And I began to think there might be a novel in this after all. So I went to Gerd and said, can I talk to your mom about that diary? And he said, of course. So I talked to his mother. And I said, it wouldn't be your story, it wouldn't be your mother's story, but you would see glimpses of the two of you. I want to write this book. What do you think? And she said, of course. And I said, and I want to explore one German family's complicity in the Holocaust. And she looked me right in the eye and she said, write that book. And so I was off and running. I started finding all the Prussian refugees I could in America, all of the survivors of the Holocaust in Vermont, and asking them questions about what it was like to have been there in that moment. And that was essentially the origins of Skeletons at the Feast. I probably interviewed, I don't want to overstate this, but I probably interviewed about 20 different people who had been in Prussia or near Prussia during those months.
What a remarkable story, and one that definitely needed to be told. You work similar magic with the Sandcastle Girls, which is actually based on your own family's history and that same awful era of the war. Please share a bit about that with us.
I'm a grandson of survivors of the Armenian genocide. So it was natural that I was going to write a book at some point in my career about the Armenian genocide. I first tried in the early 1990s, and I wasn't ready to write it. It was a terrible book. It's one young Armenian American's anger at the injustice of what at the time was a largely unrecognized genocide. I mean, obviously, Turkey and Azerbaijan still don't recognize it. So I put the book aside. You can read it at Amherst College, my alma mater. It's in my papers, but I wouldn't go there unless you're a masochist. It's a bad book. But I tried again in 2010, and The Sandcastle Girls was published in 2012. And part of the reason I tried again was because of the success of Skeletons at the Feast. I don't mean its commercial success. I mean, I felt it worked as a novel. One of the great mantras of all writers is that, Fitzgerald's expression, action is character. And you see a lot of action in dialogue. So when I was writing the dialogue for the Sandcastle Girls, I was always balancing action with education. The last thing the world needed was another memoir or history of the Armenian genocide that no one would read. So I wanted it to be a love story. I mean, think of those great love stories set in the midst of war. Atonement. Corelli's Mandolin, The English Patient. That's what the Sandcastle Girls is. It's a love story set in the First World War with the Armenian genocide as a backdrop. And so the dialogue always needed to do two things: move the story forward and or educate a reader in Indianapolis who couldn't find Armenia, much less Aleppo, Syria, on a map. And one final point about the dialogue in that book. Because so many Turkish politicians and Azeri politicians and their lobbying groups in America and Britain worked so hard to deny the Armenian genocide, it was important that almost everything the American counsel, Ryan Donald Martin, who's based on Jesse B. Jackson, the actual counsel, or the German counsel, Ulrich Lange, who's based on the actual German counsel, Walter Rosler, everything they say must be authentic, must be pulled from some of their actual cables and observations. Now, is everything they say something that Jesse Jackson or Walter Rosler said? Of course not. But when they're talking about the genocide, it's usually founded on their historical cables and letters.
When Secrets of Eden began revealing itself to you on the page, there's multiple narratives weaving throughout. It's fascinating. How complex was that tapestry of voices to create on the page?
The book began for me as a book about a crisis of faith. The inspiration was actually John Updike's novel, "And the Beauty of the Lilies," about one minister's discovery that his faith is on really shaky ground. Now, it morphed into a novel also about Vermont's dirtiest little secret, domestic violence. If you die in Vermont, 99% of the time you will be a woman. I mean, if you are murdered in Vermont, 99% of the time you will be a woman. And 99% of the time you will know intimately your murderer. And so that too factored into the book. It's one of those books I've written with multiple first-person narrators. So I do one of the things I get great pleasure from, and that is being a ventriloquist. It's narrated by a pastor, a man, a state's attorney, a woman, a new age spiritualist, a woman, and a teenage girl. My daughter, who's way smarter than me. My wife is way smarter than me, which is one of the reasons why my books work. But my daughter said something to me once that was really astute. She said, "Dad, take this as a compliment because I mean it that way. But I think your sweet spot as a writer is seriously messed up young women. And you can see that in Katie in Secrets of Eden and Connie in Midwives. You can see it to a certain extent in Elizabeth in the Sandcastle Girls, Alexis in the Red Lotus, and certainly in Cassie Bowden in The Flight Attendant. And yes, in Emily Shepard in Close Your Eyes, Hold Hands. I love it when my daughter narrates my books. She's a young actor in New York City because she so gets the women.
The Night Strangers had a fascinating way of working back and forth between first and second person narration. How complicated was that in your own mind to immerse yourself fully in the headspaces of both characters as you wrote?
The Night Strangers was inspired by, of course, Sully Sullenberger. I was at my desk and I saw a news thing come across that there's a plane down in the Hudson. So, of course, I immediately went to the TV in my house and watched this. And I began to think, what would it be like to be the pilot who isn't Sully Sullenberger? The pilot who has to ditch his jet and people die. And that was the book. And it wasn't going to be a ghost story. We talked about Hangman a few minutes ago. I'd written a ghost story, and my goal in life is never to write the same book twice. So I didn't anticipate this would be a ghost story. It was going to be about Chip and Emily's marriage and the way it falls apart in the wake of this disaster. It was going to be about Chip's post-traumatic stress disorder, Chip being the pilot. I've told you I never know where my books are going. I never outline them. And the more and more time I spent inside Chip's head, dealing with the metaphoric ghosts of the people who died on that plane, the more they became literal ghosts. I also tell you that book was really fun to research because, I fly all the time pre-COVID. I used to fly all the time pre-COVID, but I've always had a fear of flying. You just, deal with it. But for the Night Strangers, I wanted to know what it was like to be in a plane that's sinking. So I went to Groton, Connecticut, and with some National Guard aviators, I went in the dunk tank. And it has come so far from an officer and a gentleman. It's not an egg they just put in a pool anymore. Imagine a minivan suspended over a 100,000-gallon tank of water that can be configured for 56 different fixed wing and rotary aircraft. And for me, they set it up for a regional jet 70-seater, and I did 4 drops. And the fourth, as the pilot, was the best. I'm in the flight deck, 5-point shoulder harness, yoke in front of me, door behind me into the passenger cabin. They drop it into the tank, turn it upside down, and I had 28 seconds to get away out of the harness, push away the yoke, open the door to the passenger cabin, open the exit door, and swim to the surface. It was the most fun I've ever had, not at a carnival.
Talk about hands-on research. Speaking of, it must have been fun to go to Italy to research the beautiful, the light, and the ruins.
I love what John Gardner said, and this is a paraphrase. There are 2 ways to wake a reader from the fictional dream: clumsiness, bad writing; inauthenticity, bad research. So you got to do the homework. And I really enjoy all the research, even when it breaks my heart. My God, when I was researching skeletons in the Feast of the Sandcastle Girls, I would spend days shell-shocked. I would literally just be shell-shocked at the utter horror. But I knew that it was in the service of the story. Now, The Light in the Ruins was interesting to me because Tuscany really is Disneyland for grown-ups. It's all about cheese and wine and riding your bike. It's looking at amazing Duomos. But In the late summer of 1944 was an innermost string of Dante's Inferno. It was cataclysmically violent. And this all came to a head when I was researching The Light in the Ruins with a good friend of mine named Greg Lewandowski, who lives in Tuscany. And he lives in a tiny little village called Montisi. We're riding our bikes, and we're on one of those hills looking across a valley at another hill. When you're riding your bike in Tuscany, it's basically just up one hill, downhill, uphill, downhill. And he pointed out to me the granary. And he said it used to be taller. And I said, oh yeah, it was built like what, in the 13th, 14th century and it collapsed? He said, no, the Nazis blew it up when they were retreating, so it couldn't be used as a spotting tower. And when you walk through Montisi, this beautiful, magnificent medieval hill town, you'd never think to yourself, my God, in 1944, the Nazis were blowing up a 14th or 13th century granary, for God's sake, so it couldn't be used as an artillery spotting tower. And that really drove home to me the importance for The Light in the Ruins of making sure that this Romeo and Juliet love story never flinched when it came to the violence of that era. Yeah, I drank a lot of wine and ate a lot of cheese researching The Light in the Ruins, but I also took a hell of a lot of notes to try to understand what it must have been like for the average Italian citizen in this rural part of Tuscany.
Books like The Guest Room really explore the sad sides of humanity. Did you have any real-life experiences that helped to inform the writing of this particular bestseller?
You know, I know how blessed I am. Never lose sight of that. I really do. I mean, I look at my wife, I look at my daughter, I look at my life. But I also know that the world is a really dark place. And all of my books are rich with autobiographic minutiae. You mentioned The Guest Room. First of all, there is so much of me in Richard Chapman. I mean, I grew up for a couple of years in Bronxville. Their house is based on my house. Melissa, their daughter, is based on my daughter. Kristen is based on my wife. Alexandra, the Armenian sex slave. In 2013, my family and I were in Armenia on vacation. And for this trip, we've brought with us one of my daughter's friends from college, who's also part Armenian, but has never been to Armenia. She was flying back a day before us. She was on the 6 a.m. Aeroflot flight to Moscow and then JFK. And because I'm a dad, I said to her, okay, meet me in the hotel lobby at 3 a.m. so I can bring you in a cab to the airport. He was 4:30. And because I'm a dad, I was actually in the lobby probably at 2:50. And as I was waiting for my daughter's friend, I saw a girl who was younger than the two of them. And she was paying off the concierge, the night bellman, and going upstairs. And it was so clear what she was doing. And it broke my heart. It broke my heart as a father. It broke my heart as an Armenian. It broke my heart as an American. But she was the inspiration for Alexandra, the Armenian sex slave who is trafficked by Russian sex traffickers to the United States, where she will meet Richard Chapman at the world's worst bachelor party. Those characters, I hope, are all spectacularly authentic. And obviously, they've got a lot of all of us in them. Um, is it hard to access that dread? As a dad, oh my gosh, so many scenes that I wrote with Alexandra were just crushing. They just destroyed me. So many of the scenes involving Richard. How do you say to your daughter, who's 9, I'm on the front page of the New York Post because I was upstairs in the guest room with someone who wasn't your mother? How do you do that?
Readers are swept up in the disappearance of wife and mother Annalie Alberg in Sleepwalker. Tell us what that headspace is like to be writing a pure thriller like that.
You know, I wasn't thinking so much about dread, but I was thinking about grief. What is it like to lose a parent and to lose a parent without a body? For me, that was the genesis of that book. You know, some people tell me that my books are a slow burn, and that's the goal, to write character-driven stories where you have deep empathy for the people, even when they make unbelievable mistakes. Because what would literature be without mistakes? Can you imagine literature that doesn't have crime and punishment, or the secret history, or sharp objects? We need messy people to care about.
Well, you certainly created a lot of them over the years. Take the constantly moving backdrop of an ER that you brought to life in The Red Lotus. What's it like to take that kind of controlled chaos and bring it to life on the page?
Yeah, The Red Lotus had its origins when I saw 2 articles in 2 New York City newspapers. One, in the New York Times, was about how New York City rodents carry 8 different kinds of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. The other was in the New York Post about New York City's most rat-infested apartment buildings. I called up a guy named Peter Daszak, an epidemiologist, in the New York Times article. And remember, this is 2018, a year and a half pre-COVID. And he said, oh, yeah, the next pandemic's coming. And New York City is going to be in trouble because it has the 3 things you need for a pandemic: high population density, mass transportation, lots of people coming and going from overseas. And I began to envision a book set in the days before a pandemic. I didn't know more about it than that, but I envisioned that would be part of it. Then I happened to have lunch with a friend of mine in Vermont who was a Vietnam veteran. And Ken Burns' remarkable special on Vietnam had aired. And so we started talking about his experience, and every story he told me ended with this: I never told my wife that, never told anyone that. And so I began to wonder, how does a pandemic and Vietnam fit together? And so I went to Vietnam. I went to see it the way I see Vermont, on my bike. And while falling in love with the country, one evening I was having a beer with somebody who was on the bike tour with my wife and me. And she worked in a hospital. And she asked me this question: what is the opposite of a hospice? And I said, always the eager student. A neonatal intensive care unit. And she said, wrong. The emergency room. In a hospice, we do all that we can to allow someone to pass. In an ER, we do all that we can to keep them alive. And that's when I realized, okay, this book is about an ER doctor. She goes on a bike tour of Vietnam with her boyfriend, and there she discovers, after he disappears, that everything he told her was a lie. And he's harboring all kinds of secrets. And I was off and running. And I did fall in love with ER doctors researching this book. ER doctors, as we saw during the pandemic.
Remarkable.
remarkable, just heroic, unbelievably heroic, unbelievable empathy, brilliant multitaskers, and very often a great sense of humor. I just bow before them.
What was it like to assume the role of Mary Deerfield all the way back in 1662 when you began working on your latest book, Hour of the Witch?
In 1662, there's a 3-line reference in Boston's Court of Assistants to a young Puritan woman successfully divorcing her husband for cruelty. What today we would call domestic violence. For the Puritans, marriage was a civil act. It wasn't a church service. So you could divorce your husband. You could divorce your wife. And there were 5 very specific grounds for divorce. And I loved the idea of writing a book about a courageous, strong, maybe seriously messed up young woman, since she is my specialty, Mary Deerfield, divorcing her husband for domestic violence. And because it is 1662 Boston, of course, it will devolve from a civil divorce case into a criminal witch hunt. As my wife said, the first time that she read the first draft of the manuscript, she said, "Wow, is this The Crucible meets The Woman in the Window?"
Do you still enjoy as much feeling the rush of a new idea when it's first coming out of your head and onto the page?
I do. I do prefer the rush. I prefer sitting down in this room and having no idea what's going to happen. The joy is always the surprise because I really don't know what's going to happen. Now, 8 or 9 months a year, I'm in this office writing all morning, and then I'm on my bike in the afternoon thinking about what I'm going to write the next day. In the winter, I am in this office until dinner. But those moments on the bike are so great because I begin to fantasize about, well, what happens if Mary does this? What happens if Emily does this? And I just love getting to the desk and playing it out. I've never written the same book twice, and that's important to me. And some of my books have been educational in ways that I didn't expect. E.M. Forrester once said this: "We all know that fiction is truer than history because it goes beyond the evidence." I think about that a lot. We all know that fiction is truer than history because it goes beyond the evidence. When I write about German complicity in the Holocaust, when I write about the Armenian genocide, when I write about the 17th century American women who stood up against the patriarchy of Puritanism, it's better for me to do fiction than in nonfiction. And that's important to me.
Well, your books have been really important to starting so many different kinds of dialogues among readers that they may never have had without first reading them in your books and without such compelling stories to keep them interested throughout. What's coming up next along those lines?
Well, okay, the next book after The Hour of the Witch is, wait for it, The Lions of Hollywood. It's 1964, and an Elizabeth Taylor type starlet brings her entire entourage into the Serengeti on a honeymoon safari, and it all goes to hell in a handbasket. You're either getting eaten or shot. It is not pretty. Imagine, and then there were none in 1964.
Mr. Bohjalian, it's been a true pleasure. Thank you so much for taking out time to be on About the Authors TV.
Jake, take care. Thank you.